HMHS Britannic. And already, some of you are a bit confused. Darkness. Darkness, did you not read again? It's supposed to be RMS Britannic, just like her older sisters. And yes, she was supposed to be RMS Britannic, but that unfortunately never actually happened. She would instead be HMHS Britannic, or His Majesty's Hospital Ship Britannic. The third and youngest member of the Olympic-class ocean liners. The baby sister of both Olympic and Titanic, and arguably the most obscure when compared to the other two. The eldest sister, Olympic, had a long and cherished career, one of the most beloved ships of her time. And Titanic, well, that was the whole sinking thing, and that was very bad, but she was still very well known for it due to how catastrophic it was. Britannic, on the other hand, as the baby of the family, just didn't have the same notoriety, and partially because she just never had the chance to. She would sink just like Titanic, but for entirely different reasons, and would never be in commercial service. Instead, serving, as HMHS would suggest, as a hospital ship during World War I. Britannic's yard number was 433, and originally her specifications were remarkably similar to both Olympic and Titanic, as you might imagine. However, Britannic wasn't finished when Titanic sank, and the sinking and subsequent inquiries into it caused the White Star Line, who owned the ships, to seriously reevaluate the Olympic-class design as a whole and give both surviving sisters serious modifications. Olympic was sent back to Harlem and Wolff to have these changes done, while Britannic, well, it was simply decided to do the changes while she was still there, because they were still working on her anyway. In the end, technically speaking, Britannic was larger in terms of gross tonnage than both of her sisters, at 48,158. But by the time she was ready to go, she wouldn't have been the largest passenger ship in service. The German ocean liner SS Vaterland was. Still, she was large and impressive, with a length of 882 feet 9 inches, a beam of 94 feet, a height of 175 feet from the keel to the top of her funnels, a draft of 34 feet 7 inches, a depth of 64 feet 6 inches, 9 passenger decks, and a power plant consisting of 24 double-ended and 5 single-ended coal-fired boilers. The boilers drove 2 4-cylinder triple-expansion reciprocating engines, which produced 16,000 horsepower for her outboard wing propellers, as well as a single low-pressure turbine that produced 18,000 horsepower, which drove her center propeller. The 2 outboard props were bronze and 3-bladed, while the single center was also bronze but 4-bladed. Her service speed was supposed to be 21 knots, but if pushed, she could hit 23. And in her hospital ship form, she could carry 3,309 individuals. The changes that were made to her had increased her beam to allow for a double hull along the engine and boiler rooms. She also received the modification to raise 6 out of the 15 watertight bulkheads all the way up to B deck. Her turbine was a bit larger too, hitting 18,000 horsepower like I said, whereas originally it would have only been 16,000 horsepower. And that was in response to the increased width of her hull. That was more weight, so they wanted to make sure she could still hit the appropriate speed. And with the changes to the watertight compartments, that meant that Britannic was much safer than Titanic had been. She could stay afloat with 6 of her compartments flooded, not just 4. And the safety changes didn't stop there. When it came to the lifeboats, well, for one thing, she was just given more lifeboats. I think that was obvious. But her lifeboats weren't launched in the same way. On both Olympic and Titanic, their lifeboats were launched manually with Welland-type davits. However, Britannic featured a much more modern invention, gantry davits driven by electric motors. These would not only be able to launch the lifeboats much more quickly, but also much more reliably, since with the manually operated ones, they were heavily dependent on the crew being able to launch them evenly and lower them evenly, and that had stalled a lot of the evacuation on Titanic. But these modern ones didn't have to worry about that much at all, meaning that in the event that lifeboats had to be launched, they could be launched pretty fast. And yes, there were enough of them on board in order to fit everybody, so that was also nice. They did more than the bare minimum with Britannic. It wasn't perfect, though, as in some cases the davits were placed in line with the funnels, which meant they couldn't actually reach some of the lifeboats, but most of them could, and it was still a significant improvement. She had a total of 48 lifeboats on board, which could each carry 75 people, meaning at least 3,600 people could fit on all the lifeboats, which was above her maximum listed capacity. She had more than enough lifeboats, not less. Her history, well, I'm not really gonna go too deep into it because it's pretty much the same as Olympics. I already talked about her older sister, and her origins go back to the same guy, J. Bruce Ismay, in 1907, who had the idea for a family of ships that focused more on luxury and safety over speed, which White Star's rival Cunard Line was focused on. Lusitania and Mauretania were the fastest ships available, but Ismay thought if they couldn't beat them in speed, maybe they could beat them in style, as well as capacity. The Olympic classes were much larger, could carry more, and yeah, they would get across the Atlantic a bit slower, but they also didn't have to charge as much for tickets. So it was an interesting idea that likely would have been very effective. As far as Britannic herself, well, being the youngest, she was obviously the last to start construction. She was laid down on November 30th, 1911, on the very same gantry slip that was utilized by her elder sister Olympic, and 13 months after her launch. Originally, she was planned to be finished by 1914, but that didn't happen. Because of Titanic sinking, there were significant delays. She was launched in 1914, but not finished. And there's also a bit of a rumor going around regarding her name, Britannic. We have Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Well, for years, it's been suggested that that's not her original name. That originally, White Star wanted to call her Gigantic, not Britannic. But they decided to switch it because of the whole Titanic sinking thing. They didn't want it to sound too arrogant, you know? I guess is what they were going with. At least as far as the rumor goes, but there's really not very clear evidence for this at all. There is a source of a poster of her with the name Gigantic at the top, as well as some newspapers stating that White Star had ordered a ship called Gigantic. But as far as White Star and Harland and Wolff are both concerned, this was never the case. They always denied it. And an actual historian who went through the archives of Harland and Wolff stated that he personally didn't see any official reference to the name Gigantic being used or proposed for the third Olympic-class vessel at all. There were some handwritten changes sent regarding her, but those only dealt with her specifications, not her name. Honestly, based on the little evidence that there is for this, I would argue that Gigantic was never actually her name, but it may have been a descriptive. Because she is big, just like her sisters, and maybe that's what they were going for. She's gigantic. Not her name, she just is gigantic. And even if it is true, it doesn't matter. She was called Britannic in the end. Despite the delays because of the modifications, the fitting out process did start pretty quick, but it was also delayed. Not because of changes they had to make, but this is because some people decided it was a really good time to start a horrific global conflict. Yeah, World War I. Because of the war, all the shipyards with Admiralty contracts were given priority to use available raw materials for those contracts, not for civilian ones. Civil contracts, which included Britannic obviously, were heavily hampered by this. There just wasn't as much stuff to utilize to finish her. She likely would have been done a lot faster if this wasn't the case, but, well, it was. Britannic's remaining sister, Olympic, would return to Belfast on November 3rd, 1914, while Britannic still wasn't quite done. But it was nice the sisters could see each other at least. However, as things got crazier with World War I, the Admiralty began to realize that they kind of needed more ships. They didn't want to use ocean liners initially because they were big, bulky, and easy targets. Not designed for military use whatsoever, but they just needed ships. It was just the end of the story. This became even more so when naval operations extended all the way down to the eastern Mediterranean. So in May of 1915, after Britannic had completed her mooring trials, She was prepared for emergency entrance into naval service with just 4 weeks' notice. She wasn't the only one to get this treatment. Cunard's Mauretania and Aquitania were also requisitioned by the Admiralty. Originally, both were supposed to be troop ships, but they had a lot of injuries as a result of the war, so Aquitania was diverted to hospital ship duties in August. Britannic would also be requisitioned as a hospital ship on November 13th, 1915, and her sister would join her, but not as a hospital ship. Olympic was a troop ship, like Mauretania. Due to these changes, both sisters changed significantly in appearance. As an ocean liner, Britannic would have been painted quite similarly to both Titanic and Olympic, but as a hospital ship, she required a bit of a different touch. Technically speaking, the militaries involved in World War I had agreed not to actually attack hospital ships. They weren't considered valid targets. So unlike Olympic, who was painted in dazzled camouflage because troop ships were valid targets, Britannic was repainted completely white with big, bold red crosses and a horizontal green stripe. She was also significantly illuminated, so even at night, it should have been pretty clear, hey, this is a hospital! Please don't kill us. But it was unclear how well this would protect the ship because of Germany's activities during the war. They were utilizing unrestricted submarine warfare in an effort to force Britain out of the conflict by basically starving them of any and all supplies. As a result, U-boat captains were encouraged to blow up basically anything they saw, regardless of what it was, which is exactly what happened with RMS Lusitania in May of 1915, despite her not being in military service, transporting civilians. In response to that outrage, Germany claimed that there were weapons on board Lusitania, and that made the ship a valid target. It totally was the case, there were weapons on board Lusitania. Although, it's not clear whether Germany actually knew that, or just assumed. I mean, they were right, but also they may not have known for sure, and there was still a bunch of civilians in the way. Listen, World War I is a freaking mess, okay? But back to Britannic. As a hospital ship, in theory, on paper, via treaty, she shouldn't have been a valid target. She was placed under the command of Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett, and her interior was heavily modified, with 3,309 beds and multiple different operating rooms. Her common areas were transformed into rooms for the wounded, and her cabins and B-deck were left relatively alone, used to house her staff of doctors. Her first-class dining room and the first-class reception room on D-deck were transformed into operating rooms, and the lower bridge was utilized to accommodate lightly wounded personnel, ones that didn't need significant attention. Her medical equipment was installed on December 12, 1915, and she was declared fit for service that same day. She was assigned a medical team consisting of 101 nurses, 336 non-commissioned officers, and 52 commissioned officers, in addition to her crew complement of 675. She would leave Liverpool December 23rd, headed towards the Aegean Sea to retrieve and bring back sick and wounded soldiers, most of which were coming from the Gallipoli campaign, sometimes called the Dardanelles campaign. This is a particularly infamous campaign in World War I, where Britain, France, and Russia decided to unite their forces down there in an effort to weaken the Ottoman Empire by taking control of the Turkish Straits. On paper, it probably made a lot of sense. Also, it turned out that this idea was bad. The Gallipoli campaign was a disaster. It was awful. Despite outnumbering the Ottoman forces by around 200,000 men, the entire campaign turned into a complete horror show, with roughly 300,000 casualties on the side of Britain, France, and Russia. 59,202 were confirmed dead. The Ottomans didn't make out so well either. They had a total of 255,268 casualties, with 56,938 dead, but they viewed it as a victory because they had held off a superior force. And the whole mess caused significant problems for the countries on the losing end of it. They had lost a ton of men and equipment, and the tide of public opinion was not not happy with what had taken place. That was not supposed to happen, and that is exactly what happened. While all this was going on, Britannic just did her hospital duties, traveling the same route as Mauretania, Aquitania, and Olympic. It is, in fact, the only time where Britannic and Olympic would serve directly together on the same path. When she returned to Britain, she would spend a month as a floating hospital anchored off the Isle of Wight, tending to the insane amount of wounded she had received. She would take another voyage down there, lasting from March to April, partially to assist in the evacuation of the Dardanelles, because they kind of canceled that campaign. It did not go well whatsoever. And actually, it seemed like Britannic would survive the war, because on June 6, 1916, she was given back to White Star. The Admiralty decided they didn't actually need her anymore, and the British government gave White Star £75,000 to compensate them for having to convert her back from a hospital ship into the transatlantic ocean liner she was meant to be. That process was started. They did begin to make that conversion, but after only a couple months, the Admiralty was like, actually, can we get that ship back? Yeah, they realized in August that they still needed her as a hospital ship, so the conversion was halted and effectively reversed. She was taken back out on a fourth voyage on September 24th of 1916, back down to the Mediterranean. During that trip, on September 29th, she ran into a very, very violent storm, but true to her form, she survived it. She was totally fine. Handled herself perfectly, in fact. She would be back in Southampton by October 9th, but then was sent out again on a fifth voyage. And life on Britannic, despite the fact she was a floating hospital and saw her share of horrors as a result, was relatively not peaceful, but very routine. At 6 a.m. sharp, all the patients on board her were awakened. Breakfast would be served at 6:30, and Captain Bartlett would tour his ship for inspection. Lunch was served at 12:30 p.m., and everyone had tea at 4:30 p.m. The patients were given fair treatment, all things considered. So long as there were no emergencies, they received their regular treatments between meals, and those who could walk, effectively, and wished to walk, were permitted to do so. At 8:30 p.m., the patients were sent to bed, and Captain Bartlett would make his second and last inspection of the day. And since Britannic was so large, they had a lot of room to work with. I mean, not only was there plenty of space for the patients, plenty of room to explore and get necessary exercise, which can help in recovering from certain ailments, but also there were medical classes available on board for additional training for her staff of nurses. All things considered, despite not doing what she was supposed to be doing, Britannic was still somewhat of a grand experience, in line with her family's reputation. It's likely that had she been sent back to White Star and converted back into an ocean liner, she would have served incredibly well alongside her sister. But sadly, much like Titanic, fate had a different idea for Britannic. Britannic left Southampton for Lemnos on November 12th, 1916. This would mark her sixth trip into the Mediterranean, and though it wasn't known at that time, she would never again return home. She passed Gibraltar at midnight on November 15th and arrived at Naples on the morning of November 17th, where she took on additional coal and water. But she couldn't actually leave Naples on schedule. There was a pretty bad storm, and it was decided not to send her out, even though she probably could have handled it. They waited for things to calm down. Captain Bartlett noticed that there was a bit of a break in the weather and took that chance to go out again. The storms did pick up as she got out of the port, but she held her own just fine, and by the following morning the storms were gone. She passed the Strait of Messina without any issues at all, and she rounded Cape Matapan early on November 21st. By daybreak, she was smoothly steaming into what's known as the Kia Channel, which is located between Cape Saunian and the island of Kia. And given what was about to happen, she was actually in a pretty fortunate situation in that she had absolutely no patients on board at the time. She was going down to retrieve patients. She wasn't taking patients down there with her, for obvious reasons. Why would they ever do that? So the only people on board were her regular staff. A total of 1,066 individuals, 673 crew, 315 members of the Royal Army Medical Corps, 77 nurses, and her captain. Unbeknownst to everyone on board Britannic, nearly a month prior to her passing through this area, another type of ship had also been in the area, SMU-73, under the command of Gustav Seyss. Remember I mentioned the unrestricted submarine warfare, and how, while it was unlikely for Germany to target a hospital ship, given their general attitude, there might be a chance they would? Well, in Gustav Seyss's defense, he didn't directly target Britannic. What he did was lay a bunch of mines in the Kia Channel. And because these are mines, and have no way of determining whether or not a ship that comes near it is necessarily a valid target, they just, explode. Well, that meant when Britannic headed through, and sort of, hit a mine, the force of the explosion from the mine had damaged the watertight bulkhead between hold 1 and the forepeak. And the hole was very large, much larger than the holes that had been put into Titanic by the iceberg. Britannic's first 4 watertight compartments were filling with water at a very rapid rate, and the boilerman's tunnel connecting the fireman's quarters in the bow with boiler room 6 was also damaged, so water was flowing there as well. Captain Bartlett did respond appropriately and immediately. He ordered the watertight doors to be closed, sent a distress signal, and ordered his crew to start preparing the lifeboats just in case, though he did not order the boats to be launched yet. And this will become very relevant in a few minutes, but bear with me. The SOS signal was sent out and received by at least 2 other ships in the area, HMS Scourge and HMS Heroic. However, Britannic didn't know this. This is because, while the crew didn't actually realize it, the force of the explosion had caused their antenna wires slung between her masts to break. Now, this did allow Britannic to still send out messages, but she couldn't receive them, so they had no way of knowing that her distress calls were actually heard. The situation below deck was very, very, very chaotic. Along with the damaged watertight door on the fireman's tunnel, the watertight door between boiler rooms 6 and 5 also failed to close properly, meaning that the water was flowing further aft into boiler room 5. However, due to the changes made to her after the death of her sister Titanic, she actually could have survived this damage in theory. As I mentioned earlier, she could still stay afloat with the first 6 watertight compartments flooded, and based on where the water was at this point, as long as the next critical bulkhead between the boiler rooms, specifically the one between 5 and 4, didn't fail, she would have been okay, and it didn't. Those bulkheads were alright and did exactly what they were supposed to do. In theory, Britannic should have survived. However, there was one minor itsy-bitsy detail that tilted the scales against her. Portholes. Naturally, Britannic had a whole bunch of portholes, as many ships did and still do. These portholes were supposed to be closed under direct orders. However, the nurses had decided to ignore those standing orders, and many of those portholes were opened to help ventilate the wards. Now, I understand the nurses' intentions here, but the problem is, as Britannic's angle of list increased, the water was able to enter those portholes and start flooding between boiler rooms 5 and 4, which was supposed to have been sealed off, and was sealed off, but the portholes were left open. This meant that more than 6 of Britannic's compartments were flooding, but Captain Bartlett was not planning on giving up on Britannic. He was gonna save his ship, and did his absolute best to do so. Only 10 minutes after she hit the mine, Britannic was in roughly the same exact situation as her sister Titanic had been an hour after she hit the iceberg. So, basically what I'm trying to say is that Britannic was flooding way faster than Titanic was, and 15 minutes after the mine, as when the portholes went underwater, and Britannic's situation rapidly deteriorated. Unlike Titanic, which sank bow first, well, Britannic did do that, but because of the porthole issue, she started developing a list to starboard as well. Bartlett likely realized at this point that his ship was going down, but he still tried to save her because he thought he might have time to get to the island of Kia and beach her in the shallows. This would of course prevent her from going under, and in theory she could be salvaged, and she certainly wouldn't drag anyone down with her because, well, she hadn't sunk. He made the order to turn starboard towards the island, but this was not an easy thing to do because of Britannic's situation. For one thing, she was listing, and also her props were partially out of the water because she was sinking, downwardly in the front, causing her stern to raise. Plus, her steering gear was simply non-functional, it just flat out wasn't working, so they could only steer her with the props, driving the port shaft at a higher speed than the starboard side, slowly turning her in the direction they wanted to go. The evacuation was relatively orderly. Everyone on board actually knew where they should be, and these weren't passengers. These were the staff of the ship. The vast majority would head to the lifeboats, but remember, Bartlett said to prepare the lifeboats, but not to actually lower them. In the meantime, Major Harold Priestley gathered his own detachments from the Royal Marine Medical Corps to the back of the A-deck, and they started inspecting the cabins to make sure not a single person would be left behind. As Britannic continued on her desperate bid to save herself, some of the crew started becoming worried that the list was going to become too large and they wouldn't be able to launch the lifeboats. And even though the order still hadn't come from Bartlett, Third Officer Francis Laws decided to launch 2 of the lifeboats anyway, both on the port side. And this idea was awful. See, remember how I mentioned that Britannic was not only moving forward, but also her props were partially out of the water? Yeah, so as it turns out, when you lower lifeboats in this particular situation, and put them in the water next to a very large boat with giant spinning blades immediately behind, those lifeboats tend to get drawn right into them. Which is exactly what happened. Bartlett was informed of this going on, and did order the engines to stop, but there just wasn't time for that to happen. Both lifeboats were drawn directly into the propellers, resulting in... Okay, look, I'm not gonna specifically describe what happened here, because... No, but I think you can use your imagination to determine how well this went. 30 people died, horrifically, because of this stunt. Bartlett did get the engines stopped, and since he had done that anyway, the evacuation on board the lifeboats was continued. 35 were successfully launched, and in very short order. All were out by 8:50. Those modern divots she had done their job incredibly well. But Bartlett still was not giving up on his ship, so he called a halt to the last bit of the evacuation and ordered that the engines be restarted so he could try to save Britannic too. But by 9, he was told that the rate of flooding had increased due to her forward motion, and that flooding had reached D-deck. After pausing to consider how quickly they were taking on water, Bartlett realized that he couldn't save Britannic anymore. It was just too far to Kia, so he ordered to stop engines once again for the last time, and would sound 2 final long blasts of Britannic's whistle. Her dying gasps. That was the signal to completely abandon her. Bartlett stayed with his ship to the last possible moment. As water reached her bridge, both he and his assistant commander simply walked onto the deck and swam into the water. They reached a collapsible boat, and from there the captain would continue to coordinate the rescue effort, making sure everybody got off. One of the survivors would be Violet Jessup, a nurse who had famously survived both the sinking of Titanic and the incident where Olympic hit HMS Hawk. I don't know what kind of voodoo curse had been cast on her, but I mean, she survived all of these situations, so hey! And as for Britannic, well, she sank a little bit oddly. She was gradually capsizing to starboard as she went down, and by the time her stern was completely out of the water, her bow had already hit the seabed. She had sunk in a relatively shallow area, and she was longer than the depth of the water. The impact with the seafloor caused some serious structural damage to her bow, but she would finally and completely sink beneath the waves at 9:07, just 55 minutes after striking the mine. Britannic would be the largest ship lost during the First World War. But in terms of death toll, well, her survivors made out way better than Titanic. For one thing, she had enough lifeboats, and 35 were successfully launched and fully loaded, when compared to Titanic, which only launched 20 and didn't fully load them. Another thing was that help for Britannic was much closer. The first ships would perform rescue efforts within just 2 hours after the initial distress call. But perhaps more than anything, it wasn't cold. The water in the Mediterranean at that time was actually a quite nice temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, when compared to the -2 degrees Celsius or 28 degrees Fahrenheit the Titanic survivors were dealing with. Basically, this meant that there was literally no chance that anyone was going to freeze while waiting for help, even if they weren't in a lifeboat. The water was pretty nice, so as long as it didn't stay there, and suffer exposure or sunburn for multiple days, they were okay. The first rescuers to arrive were actually fishermen from Kia, who picked up as many as they could. HMS Scourge would show up at around 10 a.m., along with HMS Heroic. Several other Royal Navy ships arrived, but quickly it was realized that there weren't that many survivors left. They had gotten everybody. Out of the 1,066 people that had been on board Britannic, 1,036 survived. Only 30 people died. And, okay, I shouldn't say only, because it's still tragic. It's 30 people that are dead now, and most of them died because of that whole launching the lifeboats while the ship was still moving thing that they absolutely shouldn't have done. But, compared to her sister, I mean, this is night and day. The result was much, much better. However, only 5 were buried, as most of the people that died just weren't recovered. There were also 38 injuries, but most of those were minor, and the survivors were sent home, some of them even arriving back in the UK just in time for Christmas. Overall, the largest loss was Britannic herself, because, well, she had been a grand ship, envisioned as an ocean liner, but she was never able to be that. She wasn't given the chance. She died in the war, dwelling at the bottom of the sea, just like her older sister Titanic, and their older sister, Olympic, who had to spend the remainder of her years all alone. A lot had been planned for Britannic. She was actually supposed to be a lot grander than her older sisters as well. She was even meant to have a pipe organ, a Welt Philharmonic organ. It was built in Germany, but was never shipped out due to the outbreak of the war. It also wouldn't be claimed by Harland and Wolff after the conflict because, well, she was meant for Britannic. And Britannic was, dead. So, yeah, they didn't really have a need for the organ anymore. I suppose they could have put it on Olympic, but that also never happened. And for many decades, it was believed that that organ was lost. But in April of 2007, a group in Switzerland were restoring a Welt organ, and upon further investigation, they noticed that certain parts were signed by the German manufacturers with the word Britannic. It was her organ. The organ had been shuffled around to various different owners over the years. Basically, none of them knew what it had originally been meant for. That organ is now fully restored to working condition in the Museum für Musica Automaten in Seewin, Switzerland, and is used to this day for fully automated and manual performances. So, hey, that's pretty cool that her organ is still around, and in a way, so is she. Unlike Olympic, who was scrapped, Britannic is more like Titanic in that technically she still exists, and Britannic is way more accessible than Titanic is. Remember, Titanic sank in very, very deep water. She's very difficult to get access to, and you need specialized submersibles to hit that depth. But Britannic sits, relatively close to shore, for one, and in only about 400 feet of water. She's actually very easy to dive to, all things considered, as those waters tend to be pretty calm, and a reasonable temperature. She was discovered on December 3rd, 1975 by Jacques Cousteau, and, especially accounting for her age, she's considered to be in very good condition. Probably the easiest way one can see an actual Olympic-class liner in the modern day, since, well, none technically survived at all, and her older sister is a bit out of the way. But Britannic, can be gotten to with simple diver's training. She's pretty impressive even to this day because she's also relatively intact, with the big points of damage involving her bow, which was deformed when she hit the bottom during her sinking, as well as a large hole in her side ripped into her by the mine. She's also laying on her side, but hey, listen. She's right there, chilling, hanging out, vibing. Actually, no, she's very, very dead. But you can go see her if you want. It's partially dumb luck that she sank in such easily accessible water. It's relatively shallow. But I also think it might be partially due to her captain's last-ditch effort to save her in general. He pushed her to try to get into shallow water to beach her. He didn't make it. But as a result, in a way, he did save her. For future generations at the very least. But despite this, she is largely overshadowed by her other siblings. The Titanic, of course, is easily the most famous of the Olympics, and Olympic herself, well, had an extensive career. Britannic, on the other hand, just never had a chance to shine. Even her tragic fate was, well, not nearly as awful as Titanic's, which, as a direct result, means it's way less famous. Go figure. But there are many who still enjoy going to see her, and studying her, since her intact state, not ripped in two like Titanic, means that she's helped answer some lingering questions about the Olympic classes, questions about herself, and she did get at least one movie in the year 2000, simply called Britannic. It has one of my favorite actors in it, John Rhys-Davies, and it is awful. I don't know if they were just trying to capitalize on James Cameron's Titanic, but boy howdy, was that not a good idea. Well, I'll tell you what, no, I would be way less angry at this film, because, for one thing, John Rhys-Davies is always awesome, even in the worst kind of movie. But I would be way less angry at this film if they had just followed the story of Britannic and tried to be relatively accurate. No. Her sinking is completely fictionalized in this, to an obnoxious degree. Yes, I know, Jack and Rose's story was made up for Titanic, but there was a lot of fact in James Cameron's version of those events. Not everything was completely made up, just the central characters to carry a story forward. In Britannic's case, her sinking itself is wrong. Instead of being sunk by a mine, she's sunk by a German agent sabotaging her from within, due to her secretly carrying munitions, which, no, she was not. And this was in the year 2000. We had already investigated her wreck pretty substantially at that point. You could have figured out what the truth was and given us an accurate rendition. The movie's really awful, and I hate it. So, not recommended. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.
Every night in my dreams I see you, I feel you, that's how I know you. Go on, far across the distance and spaces between us. You have come to show you. Go on. but just one